thanks to the STBs as well for inviting me to come and talk about the Integrated National Transport Strategy and how we can all work together to capitalise on this really great opportunity to deliver real change for the way that transport works for people in this country. I'm certainly going to learn a lot from the speakers today and take everything that I hear back to the department and feed it into the development of the strategy itself. So, as Nicola said, my name is Luke Turner. I'm part of a team in the Department for Transport working on delivering the Integrated National Transport Strategy, which is led by Danny Williams, who some of you might know, who's also the CEO of Active Travel England. As a policy and strategy lead, my role is to help craft the strategy's narrative and make sure that we're feeding in all of the information that we're receiving through our engagement activities into what the final document ends up saying. On the subject of engagement, we are hosting one of our regional roadshows down in London today. Hopefully some of you have been able to get to one of our roadshow events across the country. I'm really excited to be travelling to Falmouth on Friday for our Cornwall edition. I am on the sleeper train overnight on Thursday. Slightly worried about that, but Nigel has reassured me that there are good shower facilities at Truro, so even if I turn up feeling a little bit tired, I shouldn't be too stinky. Lots of the team are down in Bloomsbury today for that London roadshow event, and that's the 8th of 11 roadshow stops across the country. So I've been asked to talk about what the INTS is, and from here on out I'm going to refer to it as the INTS rather than its full title. INTS doesn't really roll off the tongue very well, but I suppose it's a little bit better than it would be if it was the National Integrated Transport Strategy. So on why we're delivering this. So although the devolved nations have their own transport strategies, there's no overarching strategy in England for transport. The government's manifesto committed to developing a long-term strategy for transport and talked about issues around fragmentation and inefficiency, with companies and sectors failing to speak to and plan with each other. Whether it's improving access to jobs, education and public services, or ensuring the provision of safe, sustainable and healthy travel options, or aligning transport with government's ambitions around house building, I think it's fair to say this government sees transport as a crucial enabler to achieving its missions, as Lord McLaughlin has already mentioned, and it was great to hear the mayors as well talk, and was quite inspired to hear about their plans for how transport is going to unlock lots of growth and break down barriers to opportunity. And really hoping that this strategy can further support that and provide the overarching kind of vision for how that plays out. The strategy was launched in Leeds, or the vision for the strategy, I should say. Sorry, the strategy isn't out yet. It was launched by Louise Haigh, our previous Secretary of State, who stood alongside Mayor Tracy Brabin. The speech is still available to read online if you'd like to go back and hear what she said. But under our current Secretary of State, that vision remains, and the INTS will set the long-term direction for transport. The thinking is that it will be a national blueprint delivered with local leaders and partners, laying the groundwork for a cultural shift where people and their needs are at the heart of the transport system. Now, Rachel Skinner did talk about all of these strategies and plans that government is currently working on, and how the publication, the ambition to publish around spring is somewhat elastic. I think we have a bit of an excuse in our case, given the change in Secretary of State. We originally set out to publish in summer, but it's now an autumn publication date that we're working towards. So, moving on to what this might aim to achieve. Although the people-focused approach is a central part of the vision for the strategy, our Secretary of State has set out a series of other high-level priorities that will frame our thinking. One thing worth mentioning is that we recognise that many local areas are already making great progress with integrated transport, and we want to build on and not cut across the brilliant work that is already happening. This is all about giving local leaders the tools and freedom to design joined-up transport that improves people's lives. So you've got 5 sort of high-level statements there as to what the strategy will be thinking about and focusing on. I've already talked about a few, but just to pick out, we want to ensure that good public transport is provided across the country, but we do recognise and support that for many journeys, cars will remain the best option, and we have to recognise that this is a strategy for the whole of England, and that includes both urban and rural areas, so a challenge for us is how we make sure that it speaks to all parts of the country. We also recognise that the efficient movement of goods and services alongside people is an increasingly important part of our transport system. I'm sure Julian will be pleased to hear that as well, so freight and logistics very much part of our thinking around the strategy itself. So, to give you a flavour of some of the things we're considering internally as part of our early policy and strategy development, I'll talk through a few of these elements in a bit more detail, but just to caveat that these aren't guaranteed to be in the strategy itself. We don't want to preempt the outputs from our extensive engagement activities. And you will also notice that these themes are cross-modal, and that's very much intentional. We don't want this to be a modal strategy. There are plenty of other modal strategies and plans. This will sit across all of them and talk about integrated transport and how we better integrate all of those existing modes. So housing and planning, first of all, I'm sure everyone's aware of the 1.5 million house building target that the government's committed to delivering over the course of this parliament. We want to ensure that transport is considered from the outset in terms of new house building, but also new town building. And MHCLG, the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, has its own long-term housing strategy, new towns programme that we want to align with and feed into too. Reliability, if transport is going to work better for people, then obviously there needs to be trust in the system to get you where you want to go and when. That's something that we're considering. Data and technology, I think it's no surprise that that's a crucial part of an integrated transport system. And better use of data, for example, in providing live information to passengers or easing congestion on roads through traffic management are all things we're thinking about. Inclusion and accessibility, I think for our Secretary of State this is crucial, and she said that accessibility should be a priority and not an afterthought, and that goes for safety as well, both in terms of personal safety, especially around the violence against women and girls part of the Safer Streets mission. That's definitely something we're thinking about, but then also the safety of transport infrastructure more broadly. Integration, clearly that's a theme that runs throughout the strategy, but in terms of integration between different modes of transport, how can we encourage people to take more multimodal trips? Sustainability has been mentioned as well, and we can't think about delivering a national transport strategy without considering how we deliver greener transport. And then all of this will be underpinned by the roles and responsibilities of local, regional and national government, as well as delivery partners in the private sector. And I think that will underpin everything we say and make it really clear as to who we think is responsible for delivering certain parts of what the strategy says. Again, as Rachel Skinner pointed out first thing this morning, there are plenty of government strategies and plans, and just to pick out a few that we think are really important that this strategy, the INTS, is integrated with. We need to look sideways as well as forwards, was a quote I picked out from what Rachel said. Clearly funding is really important. Funding's come out a lot in our regional roadshow events. We're aware that the spending review is going on at the same time that we're developing this strategy. And what we are doing is working within the Department for Transport to make sure that all spending review bids can align as much as possible to what we're developing in terms of strategic themes. And obviously that will play out over the course of the next few months. This strategy itself won't address the kind of mechanisms of funding, but rather set out the broad principles for delivering better integration. Devolution is obviously a really important part of the strategy, and that's been set out in the devolution white paper. The 10-year infrastructure strategy and the industrial strategy are really important as well, and we're speaking to colleagues across government to make sure we're aligned. And then there'll also be strategies and plans that come within DFT, and the idea is that the INTS will sit above and be supported by all of those other documents. So hopefully, it's not moving well. Not sure if that's broken, but sorry, could someone move the slide on for me? I think it might be jammed. I can carry on without the next slide, but I might just wait a minute to see whether we can just fix that. Hopefully that paints a high-level picture of some of the themes that the strategy might include when it's published, again, later this year. Just waiting to see whether we might be able to move on. Or, yeah. We know that for maximum impact, if we're going to deliver something that is going to change the way that we approach transport over the next 10 years, we need to listen to the views of people across the country. And that includes both people who work in the transport sphere, but also ordinary people. There we go. Excellent. Thank you very much. Ordinary people who may or may not currently use the transport system. That's not to say that all of those who work in the transport sphere aren't ordinary people, but we want to speak to the public as well. and make sure everything that they feed in is reflected in the strategy. Still got that. So there are a few things here that I just wanted to pick out in terms of our engagement plan. A lot of these are, well, either wrapped up or ongoing. For example, the call for ideas, hopefully a lot of you managed to feed into that. It closed on the 20th of February. We had over 6,000 responses, so the team have got a lot to do over the next few weeks, and that will explain, if you don't hear from us for a while, what's going on. We're analysing all of those responses. The regional roadshow, I just want to take this opportunity as well to thank our colleagues from the STBs for their support in getting these events off the ground and making sure that the right people attend in each location. It's been a lot of work to get those 11 events delivered, but we think they've been really successful. The people's panels, this is our opportunity to target sessions around members of the public and a focus on engaging seldom heard and underrepresented groups. And then there'll be further engagement down the line once we've considered all the input from those streams above and settled on a series of focus areas for the strategy. Excellent. And then just to finish, I wanted to just highlight one of our roadshow events, which happened just down the road in King's House Conference Centre in Manchester. So Minister Lightwood attended the event and kicked things off. And the workshops focus on a series of themes, as they have done at each one of our roadshow stops. And just to give you a sense of what those conversations have looked like, we've talked about solutions to barriers that exist in terms of integrated transport in different regions. We've celebrated regional successes, for example, here in Manchester, the B network, clearly, and we want to learn and apply those instances across the country where possible. And then the 5 main themes for the workshop are focused on these, and hopefully, given everything I've said so far, this won't come as a surprise. But we're thinking about how to leverage transport to enable access to opportunities and jobs. We want to investigate the role of transport in delivering good places to live and work across the country. In terms of sustainability and climate, how do we adopt measures to enable greater deployment and or use of clean transport options in regions? That user experience, accessibility and inclusion is crucial, and we're looking at priority areas to be addressed to ensure that transport system meets people's needs. And then finally, what measures can we look at that would enable more people to cycle, walk and wheel? So hopefully that gives you a sense of what we're thinking about in terms of INTS at this stage, and it's still early days, and we want to make sure that we consider everything we've heard through our engagement and make sure that's fed in. But I will be around for the rest of today, so if anyone has any specific questions or wants to chat some more about anything I've mentioned in particular, then I would very much welcome that. Thank you very much.
Good morning. So, what do passengers want from an integrated transport strategy? I think, first of all, for those of you who are not familiar with Transport Focus, we are the consumer watchdog for users of Britain's railway, for bus, coach and tram passengers in England outside London, and also for users of the roads managed by National Highways. And our job is to make sure that the user's interest is at the heart of policy decisions about tomorrow, but also to find out what the experience is like getting around today. And then using that insight to engage with decision makers, whether they be operators or the clients procuring the services, to try and make a difference, bringing people together to discuss and find solutions to challenges. So, I think it goes without saying, I hope most people in this room would agree that it is a good thing that the National Integrated Transport Strategy is in the offing. And I'm just going to share some thoughts about what passengers some issues to consider from a passenger perspective as this is brought together. So, I think before we start thinking about integrated transport, it's probably worth just pausing and reflecting on what passengers want, what people want from transport. And actually, it really is not rocket science. It is about getting from A to B with minimum fuss, reasonably quickly, reliably, obviously, affordably, and safely. And of course, for some people, and it is only some, they are interested in doing that, causing the least damage to the environment. So, integrated transport. Well, actually, I think it is so important that we all realise in this and keep it at the forefront of our minds that actually those things will be the same, whether you're talking about transport or integrated transport. And I suppose the caution that we're all as humans quite capable of overcomplicating everything and getting so into the delivery of the thing that we've forgotten actually what we're trying to achieve. So I just encourage you all to think those things, keep them at the forefront of everybody's minds. And of course, there's the environment elements to that as well. Well, does it matter anyway? Well, it does matter, actually, if we want fewer car journeys for congestion, air quality, carbon, or any other reasons. And if transport networks aren't integrated, jumping in the car is often going to win. And of course, if you have an EV, increasingly, you can at least pretend to yourself that you're causing less environmental damage than you otherwise might be. And of course, it's not just those elements. If you don't have a car, it matters, whether that's because you can't afford one, because you have a disability and you cannot use one, or just through choice. So, for economic reasons, environmental reasons, health reasons, social inclusion reasons from a disability and various other aspects, but also that affordability reason. It does matter. This is important stuff. So, I think there are three elements, really, that are worth pulling out here. There's the practical barriers, there are the emotional barriers, and there are also some price and ticketing barriers. But let's start having a look at the practical ones. Co-location of bus, train, tram stations, running buses via railway stations where possible, all things to look at. Of course, it's really important that we don't end up actually making the transport system worse for the people who just want to go into town because the bus is now going round the railway station and taking 10 minutes longer. All those things need to be thought through. But maximising the opportunities for connections, avoiding these silly little missed by a couple of minutes for no particularly apparent reason. All those things need to be thought through, particularly in evenings and perhaps on Sundays where the frequency of the service is less than it otherwise would be. I think it's very important the accessibility point's already been stressed here. Level access at interchanges, and I don't mean that in the sense of just the grand interchanges, but the ability to get across a road from one side of the other to catch a bus going in the other direction, for instance. Drop curbs, as well as the more sort of sophisticated infrastructure, as it were. I think making it as intuitive as possible for people to make interchanges is so important because there's such a low barrier, really. You put barriers, literal or otherwise, in people's way, they will just get in the car. So the more you can do to make it almost impossible to get this wrong would be a good thing. So I think the other element about this is confidence. To have the confidence that your interchange is going to work. And I was reflecting as I came up this morning across from Doncaster on a TPE train approaching Stockport. The train would tell me about the availability of taxis from Stockport station, including some phone numbers for taxi companies. You might have thought there were no buses in Stockport, or indeed any other connecting trains from Stockport station. Now, I'm not knocking TPE for providing that information for people who want a taxi, but it's just interesting how even those sort of basics, we are a bit behind the curve in this country on integration. So, The emotional barriers. I think tackling the awareness that non-car options actually even exist is worth considering. You know, do we need to have the equivalent of the try a train initiatives, try an integrated journey initiative, and actually help people understand that it probably isn't as bad as they perceive that it would be, and it probably doesn't take quite as long as they think it will, or they would save that much more time by getting in the car. So often people, you know, we're all creatures of habit, aren't we? Helping people lift their sights is worth considering. Making it as simple as possible for people to plan the journey and plan their options, you know, real clarity about where you get on and off for each of the leg. Again, the moment it becomes complicated and you're not quite sure, you'll get cold feet and not do it. So obviously the schedule information has to be accurate. The NAPTAN database showing where the bus stops are actually has to be where they are. All that stuff has to be maintained really, really well. But also it's worth thinking about real-time replanning. You know, most of us will be familiar with Google or our sat-nav replanning for us on the hoof in the car. But what's the equivalent of that on public transport? Could that be done in a coherent way? A number of bus companies have a pledge around if they can't, for some reason, run the last service of the day, that they will get you home. But how does that work if it's the last connection that you missed? I think that's worth thinking about, again, from this confidence perspective. Price and ticketing barriers. Making price and payment so easy that people just don't really have to think about it is probably the aspiration. Tackling that perception that it's all very complicated and will cost an arm and a leg, and in some cases, of course, tackling the reality that it is expensive paying for each leg individually. Now, I've no idea whether when I went to the National Highways Bedford office the week before last, whether I could have got a better price than I did on that journey from Peterborough to Biggleswade and then across by bus to Bedford. But I'm afraid I decided not to invest the time researching it and hope that our finance director still reimburses me. Each element has to work. Reliability really matters. You know, we all know that reliability matters in public transport and indeed in road transport. But where you are connecting from leg to leg, it matters even more, unless you've got a really, really high frequency service, obviously, where if you miss one, there's another one coming along. And it's not just timekeeping. Lifts and escalators have to work. When they break, they have to be mended really, really quickly. Otherwise, it is only the able-bodied who can get about, and that's not right. Spares have to be held. It's no good getting a back order from Schindler in 3 weeks' time to mend some crucial piece of equipment. Got to have this stuff in stock. Just on the reliability point, it's interesting, my daughter is currently studying away from home, and she boards away during the week and then comes home on a Friday night, which involves getting a bus to Hatfield railway station and then up to Peterborough, changing at Stevenage. And there are occasional Fridays when it all works. Either the bus hasn't come or a bus did come but it wasn't showing on the app. One or other of the trains is cancelled or just misses the connection. And it's interesting that she has said, I think I'm going to take up Granny's offer of paying for driving lessons this summer. It's sad, isn't it? But that's the reality. Now, we mustn't forget the private car, of course. As Luke mentioned, for a lot of journeys, it is the sensible, practical option for people. But do have a think about how the private car can be better integrated with public transport, whether it be through park and ride in a rail context, or exploring where parking and catching a coach could be quicker for people, could hit that minimum fuss reasonably quick, etc., agenda. So do have a think about that. We did a bit of work a couple of years ago with National Highways, or it was Highways England as it was then, looking at exactly that stuff, and that's on our website if you would like to look at it. So just to finish up, I think it is my key message is, remember, this is all about the people. It's not about transport. It's not about integrated transport. It's about humans trying to get from A to B. And just make sure that when you get stuck into the detail of all this, you don't forget that by mistake. And also just bear in mind that the things we were all doing in 2014, as Lord McLaughlin said earlier, aren't the ones we're doing now. COVID has changed stuff. The data might not reflect current reality. Be aware of all that. But do make sure that the people who you want to use the network that emerges from the integrated strategy, national or local deployment thereof, are involved in its genesis. And otherwise, it might just misalign with what the people are actually going to do, and we've all wasted our time. Thank you very much indeed.
Good morning, everyone. I'm sure you all sat there and understood every single word that Guy was talking about, because we're all passengers. But now we're moving to the mysterious world of freight. Cue mass exodus, most often. Let me start by asking you a question. Is there a freight or logistics customer in the room? Well done, well done. A few of you have already got the message. We are all freight and logistics customers. The furniture that you're sitting on, the clothes that you're wearing, everything you eat and drink is all dependent on freight and logistics working successfully. And it does 99% of the time. But people seem to assume that things just materialise on the supermarket shelves. They don't. There is a supply chain behind them. About the only time that most people take an interest in freight and logistics in when there's a toilet roll crisis, as there was 5 years ago, as Patrick was telling us, because it is just assumed that freight and logistics will happen. And that's fine. And to an extent, there's no particular reason why citizens should care particularly about the freight and logistics supply chain which delivers what they want. However, it's much, much more important that policymakers have a broader understanding of what freight and logistics does for the country. DFT do pay great tribute to that, as do the STBs. The STBs in the, 5 or 6 years you've been in existence, have actually acquired a great deal of understanding and knowledge of freight and logistics, and we've tried in CILT to help a little bit in that process. But we are moving to a different governance structure in the country with the evolution, which is to be applauded. But that will mean that there are a lot more people out there who don't understand freight and logistics now, but they need to, because where they're going in the future. Why? Well, if you think of the government's key missions going forward, it's pretty important that they're backed up by a robust freight and logistics system. So just to pick a few, for example, if we think about the prime growth agenda, truly underlying everything that the country's future is based upon, all those wealth creators, be they retailers, manufacturers, logistics companies, they all utterly depend on the raw materials coming into the plants, the stores, the warehouses, and they all utterly depend on the product going out to serve their consumers, be they industrial or be they individuals like you or I. So it is so blindingly obvious, it's almost insulting to say, but it is so often forgotten. Then let's look at house building. Every single house that's built requires about 30 tonnes of aggregates. That's the concrete foundations, the concrete for the paths, the tarmac for the roads to serve those houses. Those hundreds of thousands of houses that we're going to need to build will need millions and millions of tonnes of aggregate. In the old days, that would have been dug up around the corner, but those reserves of sand and gravel locally have pretty much all now been exhausted. As a result of that, the aggregates have to come from distant quarries in the Mendips, the Peak District, Leicestershire and places like that, or they have to come from ports where sea dredge, sand and gravel can be landed and taken to where it's needed. But the task of getting those aggregates from the quarry or the wharf to the local area for the builders, the construction companies, to start building those estates is no small task and needs to be done. And we don't all want 44-tonne tipper trucks going down our roads, going to a building site. Indeed, quite often the most contentious part about housing development is that construction phase, so it all needs thinking about. And then the industrial strategy, which Luke put on one of his slides there. One of the big things that's happening at the moment is decarbonisation of the steel industry. Tata at Port Talbot are going ahead with an electric arc furnace. That will require about 3.5 million tonnes of scrap metal, which will come from the urban areas around the UK, because that's where scrap is generated, and some iron, some pure iron to be imported. About 3.5 million tonnes of material. About 95% of that will move by rail from the city, from the scrap collection places around the cities, and from ports to go to Port Talbot Steelworks. Without that effective transport link, Tata could not decarbonise the steel industry, the steel factory in Port Talbot, which until the heavy end closed, the blast furnaces and the coke ovens, alone generated 5% of total UK carbon emissions. So these are big, big deals. So it matters. It matters to the country, it matters to the economy, it matters to our quality of life, it matters to the environment in which we live. But it's driven by and operated by actually a fairly small number of large commercial organisations. Transport and logistics is an entirely private sector activity, and it works extremely efficiently. But it's very, very focused. So somewhere about 80 or 90% of the freight that moves in the UK is controlled by about 24 companies. That's the big retailers, the big manufacturers and quarry companies, and the big logistics companies. So we absolutely have to provide what they need to create wealth, to create jobs, to create the environment and the supply chains we need for our everyday living. They are all, of course, very logical, very well informed, very rational people making those key decisions. Profit-driven, of course. They have to deliver that logistics service or buy that logistics service in the most cost-effective way they can. So it is fundamentally money-driven, but with now a strong overlay of environmental and carbon. The sort of corporate social responsibility, CSR factor, is there for all those big companies now. And having done away with disposable packaging, stopped testing cosmetics on animals, one of the least customer-friendly things that they do is their logistics activity. The act of delivering the goods to the stores is intrusive, can be noisy, can be loud, can be disruptive to people's lives. So it matters how the goods get into their production facilities and how it gets from there to their customers. Does anybody take decisions purely on the basis of the environment? No, they don't. They are still fundamentally financially driven, but with the environmental overlay. So that's an interesting dynamic in terms of how we motivate and serve and help them to do the right things. So given that it's private sector driven and operated, what's the role of government? What do those companies need from an integrated transport strategy? There are two key areas I would suggest in this. One is the infrastructure, the routes, the road and rail routes on which those trains and trucks have to operate. And yes, to a degree, the ports and the airports into which ships and airplanes arrive. On the whole, ports and airports are privately provided within government oversight. But the roads and the railways are clearly provided by the public sector. The capacity and the efficiency of those road and rail links is key. However efficient the train is or the truck is, they can't work at their best unless the routes on which they run, the railways and the motorways are operating efficiently. So number one requirement from the freight and logistics industry is for an efficient transport infrastructure system in the country. That's in terms of the total capacity of those systems, but also how it is allocated. Because clearly, none of that infrastructure is purely for freight, nor is it purely for passenger. And one of the things we're going to need to think very carefully about with the devolution agenda is that devolved governments will inevitably be focused almost entirely on their own passenger services. Yeah, we see it already in Manchester with the B line, and there's nothing wrong with that, but local devolved administrations need to appreciate that their citizens, their voters, also need to be housed and fed and their waste taken away, which is a freight activity. So the infrastructure is common to both passenger and freight, must be seen as that, and must be regulated and managed as that. We don't have separate freight and passenger infrastructure. It's a pan-sector, pan-economy piece of facility. So we must think very hard indeed about government's role in provision of infrastructure, of course in a way which is not environmentally disruptive, or at least it minimises the amount of environmental disruption, and which is timely and efficient and affordable. Because for sure some of the infrastructure projects, not most obviously HS2, have become very, very unaffordable. And therefore we need to think much more clearly about smaller schemes, cheaper, more easily deliverable and more efficient. Certainly within the next 5 to 10 years, the days of the mega project are over. So we need that government focus under the INTS on infrastructure provision. The other thing we need is land use planning, because there's an inextricable link between land use planning and transport. If you build something, it will cause transport. Transport needs to go somewhere, be it a warehouse, a port, a store, or whatever it is. You cannot get away from the fact that any transport activity must be integrated with a land use planning strategy for the country, the region, the town, or whatever unit you happen to be talking about. And there is very, very little appreciation of that in most planning circles. It is guided by central government, but has to be implemented through local authorities. And with the best will in the world, 350, somebody told me about 350 local authorities cannot all have planning officers who understand freight and logistics. It's much better with the STBs, because they're larger units of scale. Hopefully the devolved governments will also have some understanding of that, but there remains a massive gulf of knowledge and understanding amongst the key people who plan the land use in this country. What do we need? Well, two things really I think I would highlight, and they're at opposite ends of the supply chain. Firstly, the part that you will see most in the urban realm. Deliveries to shops, which have to happen. Very few shops, especially the smaller ones, have back doors to which goods can be delivered. An awful lot of places have to be delivered through the curbside. That's the same curbside that we walk on, that we cycle past, we have to park against. Local authorities fundamentally need to understand that it isn't just about the walking, the cycling, the taxi, the bus. There has to be that local delivery element as well, appreciated and planned into urban realm street schemes. That's a very granular thing, very localised, and can only be done at a local level. The other end of the scale I want to talk about is a much more national and regional issue, and that's about the key building blocks of a supply chain. Now, in many ways, freight is already the most integrated system you could possibly think about. So take the chairs you're sitting on, for example. They will almost certainly have come from China. So they will have been picked up from a factory in China by a truck, taken to a port in China, shipped to a port like Felixstowe, London Gateway, or Southampton in the UK. They'll have been taken very likely by train from the port to an inland terminal. Could be Trafford Park down the road here in Manchester. It could be to Daventry or Northampton, one of the terminals in the golden triangle of logistics, as it's called, in the centre of the country, to a national distribution centre. It will then move from a national distribution centre to a regional distribution centre, and then from there it will move to the store or the construction site or wherever the final destination is. Now, those warehouses, which are what national distribution and regional distribution centres are key building blocks in getting the stuff to you or to the person that needs it quickly and efficiently. They are large places. 1 million square feet, several football pitches is what we're talking about these days. But there aren't very many of them, and they need to be in the right place. They need to be close to the road network, but ideally they also need to be alongside the rail network so we can get as many of the legs of that supply chain from the port to the warehouse, to the regional warehouse, at least those legs by rail rather than by road to have the best chance of decarbonising the supply chain, but also to increase productivity. Because almost every freight chain that we now run is at least 50 lorries worth of freight on one train. Some of them are over 100 lorries worth of freight on one train. So that's one train driver doing the work of 50 or 100 lorry drivers. Now, granted, there's probably a handful of other railway staff involved at loading and unloading the train. But broadly, there's a huge improvement in productivity of the trunking leg, the long-distance trunking, by modal switch from road to rail. So, and by the way, those lorry drivers are in very short supply. They're getting older, and because of the lifestyle, younger people and women just don't want to do those long-distance trunking jobs, especially sleeping in the cab on the side of the road. So we need to move towards a model where you trunk by rail, ideally electric rail, and you distribute by battery truck from a regional warehouse, because those regional delivery jobs are much more people-friendly. You can go to work, you can do your day's work, you can drop the truck back at the depot, and you go home to your family and your friends. That's what's not to like about that. It's the trunking is the issue. So, as part of this integrated national transport strategy, we need to be thinking about modal switch, not just of people from cars to public transport, but from trucks to trains on those long-distance legs of the supply chain. Not so much on the local delivery, that is the natural and correct role for the truck to do for that final delivery. So, for, if you like, social reasons, lifestyle reasons of the people involved, and for environmental reasons, that's what we need to do. Now, there's one other aspect of this land use planning piece which I want to draw to your attention, and that is that certainly around the big cities, where we need to get a lot of building materials into the city, we need to take a lot of waste, scrap metal, other things out of those cities. We need to have logistics, transport, freight transport facilities not right in the centre, but around the periphery of cities. So around ring roads, alongside the main arterial railways coming into those cities, we need to plan and preserve the land alongside those corridors for freight and logistics. Because if you want an intermodal terminal, where you transfer from rail to road, by definition it can only be alongside a railway line. So lots of land uses, especially housing, are very footloose. Many freight facilities have to be where the infrastructure is. So again, back to the importance of land use planning. It is absolutely crucial to get that right. We can do this. An integrated transport system for freight and logistics as well as passenger is eminently doable, but we must plan for freight and logistics, and credit to Luke and his colleagues for putting freight and logistics into the INTS. But we must not just pay lip service to what's required, we must act. And we must act on that strategic planning, both for route capacity and land use planning. We must act on modal switch and incentivise those logical, profit-maximising commercial companies to do the right thing that society wants, as well as what their stakeholders want. It is all doable, but we can't expect it all to happen from bodies like this and in Parliament. We must have focus, and we must have delivery, and we must put a timeline down by which we're going to do each of these elements. Not all at once, clearly that's not possible, but a logical sequence to delivering the infrastructure and the terminals and the modal switch to achieve what we want to do. So, good news, it is all doable. Hope you understand a bit more about it now than you did when you came into this room this morning. It's a wonderfully complex and fascinating activity. I've been doing it for 45 years now, so I can reflect on that with some justification. But it is fundamental to our way of life. Thank you very much indeed.
Now, panel, thank you very much for joining us this morning. What I'd really like to explore is why it's important to use STBs to help to actually deliver the integrated transport strategy. So would you be kind enough to just introduce yourself again to the panel and give us your thoughts in turn? Maria, can we start with you?
Yeah, of course. Hello, I'm Maria Machancoses. I'm the Chief Exec at Midlands Connect, which is the subnational transport for the Midlands, covering from beautiful Lincolnshire all the way to Herefordshire. So it's nice to see a Midlander sharing the panel with me today. So it is really important because we've been up and running now for a good 10 years. This is a very special year for Midlands Connect. And there is a clear sense of appetite and commitment from local authorities and the mayors to work with national bodies about making sure that it all fits together somehow. You know, that we locally we don't become that parochial that we lose sight of where those beautiful places sit in the national economy and the national picture, but also that nationally we're not becoming so obsessed about big north-south movements that the east-west connectivity gets missed out, and actually that we do actually don't acknowledge the effort of transport and mobility that is happening at local levels. So some national transport bodies are a very good platform for those conversations and those trade-offs to take place. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Nicola. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Nigel Blackler. I'm lead officer for Peninsula Transport. For those of you who are not familiar with our geography, we cover the area from Somerset through Cornwall and Devon, Torbay and Plymouth. So we're in the far southwest. We're the newest of the subnational transport bodies. We're the smallest. But importantly for us, in terms of what Nicola said about what role STBs have, and we sit above the local authorities in our area who are responsible for transport, but we sit beneath the Department for Transport in that important layer where we can look across local authority boundaries, because transport doesn't respect those boundaries, and you need a strategic body that looks across that, looks at it from a transport at that perspective, and is able to bring together the integration which you heard Luke talk about earlier. So I think we're ideally placed to do that. We're doing it already in the work that we're doing and bringing together local authorities, transport operators, or strategic transport partners, such as National Highways, Network Rail, Great Western Railway, Cross Country. All those people we're regularly engaging with now to look at transport at the regional level. And I think that's the important thing. And going forward, I think that puts STBs in a really good place to actually deliver the integrated national transport strategy which the government would like to see and actually the country needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you.
Hi, I'm James White. I'm technical lead for the Western Gateway. I'm not Alan Creedy, sorry. Okay. He is here in the audience, but I'm not him. And just for those of you who aren't familiar with the Western Gateway geography, we stretch from Gloucestershire in the north down through South Gloucestershire, Bristol, Bath, North East Somerset, North Somerset, on down through Wiltshire and Dorset to Bournemouth, Christchurch and Pools. There's a bit of a sort of north-south alignment, but east-west links, north-south links, all critically important to the way our region runs. Population of about 3 million, so we're slightly bigger than Peninsula, but we are the second smallest of the subnational transport bodies. I probably haven't got all that much to add to what Maria and Nigel have already said, because I think our role really is to see across the boundaries, to make sure, really in the sense that our local authorities don't look too inward. That does tend to happen at times. There's always a duty to cooperate between authorities. It could be stronger. I think we're in that role to be able to bring all of our local authorities together to see that wider regional picture. And just in line with the Integrated National Transport Strategy, we've got a piece of work going on at the moment where we've commissioned consultants to come up with some guidance to help our local authorities to identify the best locations, the best potential opportunity areas for new housing from a regional transport and connectivity perspective. We're not stepping on any toes here. We're there to try and help to identify sites which maybe they hadn't thought about because there is a regional view to look at. So it's about bringing together that regional view. Again, as Nigel said, with all our different partners like Rail and National Highways and our train operating companies, but essentially seeing that bigger and wider picture, which might get slightly lost if we weren't there.
Thank you, James. And Off the back of that, I'm just wondering how you feel, panel, that what do you feel local authorities will actually want from the integrated national transport strategies? What do you think they would really, really need? Maria?
Well, we heard this morning a lot. It was really great to see the mayors in action. I don't know if you saw the debate that was happening upstairs. I think they're really making a very clear signal here. Is look, we want the National Transport Strategy to give a good framework. I think, look, set that out. You don't want it to be too prescriptive because we acknowledge every part of the country is different. In the Midlands, within the Midlands, we've got really different areas. You cannot compare Birmingham to Hereford City, right? So they're setting the framework, the directional travel from a government perspective. What matters to government when it comes to transport? How we need to go about integrating transport is a really important thing. But local authorities, what they will want is beyond that framework to empower them, and that's when the devolution agenda is so important, to empower them to actually adapt that framework to their own places, their own towns and cities, and to make decisions on things without having to double-check it, triple-check it with anybody else. It's that freedom to say, we know our places, we know our towns, we know our people, we know our strengths, therefore this is how we will want to go about our local transport plans. And by the way, we need the certainty that the funding, the resource, the conversations with government will be there to empower us to get on with it. So I think that's one area that I think we're going to see more through the local government review and the devolution agenda. It will become quite thoughtful in terms of the appetite for that to happen. And the second area is the real clarity on the directional travel, particularly on new areas in innovation. So, we all want to hear from government how we're going to go about the decarbonisation agenda. Is there going to be a measure towards it? How government will measure success when it comes to integration? So there is it going to be primarily EV? Is there going to be room for testing other new innovative solutions like hydrogen or whatever with freight, for instance? So that direction of travel of innovation and where government is going next in terms of new thinking and new technologies is something that they will also welcome.
Interesting. Nigel, James, did you want to add to that at all?
Thanks, Nicola. Just picking up on what Maria said and following on from that, I think from a local authority perspective, what local authorities will clearly want is if the government set the framework and the conditions where you can deliver integrated transport through the legislation that they're bringing through, the bus services bill, the rail reform, and with this integrated transport strategy, if you create that umbrella under which it is possible to deliver more integration for users of the transport system in this country, but local authorities, from their perspective, sat right at the bottom, will be saying, please give us the resources to do so. And I think that comes to a point that Mayor Burnham raised in his speech earlier about the importance of the outcome of the spending review for transport. Because if we don't get the resources, we cannot implement the approach which everybody would like to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to make exactly the same point, Nigel. Stole my thunder there. I'll just like to add about the need to have that clarity of roles, that it needs to be, I think, crystal clear what's going to be responsibility of the combined authorities, whatever shape and form they might take, what's still going to be responsibility for government. And Maria talked about that whole decarbonisation side and EV versus hydrogen. We are still going to need a very strong steer from central government on certain issues, but equally we need to know exactly where do our powers lie, where do our roles lie, so there's no fudged or grey areas, because I think if the greyer the area and the more fudging we do, the more things then just slip through the net, which then just undermine the INTS. But this is a real opportunity to make sure it doesn't happen.
Absolutely. And you have mentioned the mayors and the mayor speaking this morning. I'm just wondering how you might be able to work with the mayoral combined authorities to improve that level of service. I just want to throw that out there.
So we're very lucky. I mean, in the Midlands, we've got at the moment 2 mayors, Richard Parker in the West Midlands and Claire Ward in the East Midlands. Soon, in the next month or so, as part of the mayor election, we'll have a new mayor in Greater Lincolnshire. So, in less than 2 years, the Midlands has gone from 1 mayor to 3, but there's still a massive area of the Midlands that will not be covered for a mayor for I think, for a while yet, anyway, for at least 4 or 5 years. And there's also mayoral authorities are at different stages of development. Some of them are brand new, some of them have been well established, you know, the West Midlands Combined Authority, trailblazer with Greater Manchester. So their ability, their capability and the ability to do things differs from one place to another. So one of the things that subnational transport bodies are becoming extremely helpful is for leaders to actually acknowledging that different stages of transition in terms of devolution, to actually make sure that they collaborate. And as I said, instead of looking at it as we are great, we devolved, we're super important, let's actually acknowledge that we need the transport does not acknowledge administrative boundaries, and let's look at corridors, for instance. They're very keen to look at how their businesses link to the ports and the airports of the Midlands. You know, at the moment, we've got a number of corridors that take us to Holyhead, to Liverpool, to, you know, so it's not just within the Midlands, it's to the north and the south, Felixstowe. We do a lot of work with colleagues there. So mayors do need that, as I said, that platform, because to collaborate and to know what's the thinking in transport in other parts of the country, not just in their own areas. So I think that's going to be really important moving forward. And their officers are all going to be very busy setting up their own plans, their own strategies, yet they need help in terms of, well, how is ticketing going to work between Coventry and Leicester, which are two different places with two different authorities? If they want to encourage more people on their system, how are they going to work together in terms of buses crossing those administrative boundaries? So again, STBs become a helpful place to go for that sort of collaboration. So we're very pleased. They're very committed to work together, and that's a great thing.
Gentlemen, did you want to pick up on this at all?
I'm in a slightly different position down in the Peninsula, where the local authorities are yet to agree the geography and the governance of a combined authority for our area. So we haven't got a mayor coming into being in the near future. So I think that just means it's all the more important that Peninsula Transport as an STB continues to maintain the focus on strategic transport issues in our area. And we let that local governments and devolution model play out, and what we must avoid is losing focus on making the right decisions around strategic transport in our area, and continuing to make the case to government for why we need the resources to improve transport, whilst the devolution model plays out over a number of years to come.
Yeah, we're in a very similar position. We have one combined authority at the moment, which is the West of England Combined Authority. There were some exciting proposals put forward for a mega combined authority involving Somerset, which is actually in Peninsula, Somerset, Dorset, Wiltshire, Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, but that didn't get through that first round of priority devolution proposals. But it may well come back in a different shape or form. So we're several years away from having any new combined authorities. So I think it's therefore it's the opportunity for us really to be involved in those discussions as much as we can, to press the point that the new combined authorities need to look at transport from that wider, that regional perspective. We're there to help pull them all together to ensure that they do work alongside each other, because we could end up with possibility of combined authorities actually quite small and might not necessarily want to see that bigger picture. And indeed, transport may not be high up on the agenda as some of these combined authorities. So we're there to make sure that transport very much should be high up on the agenda. But ultimately, yeah, we're there to help our emerging combined authorities.
Absolutely, great. Now, your STBs cover very diverse areas in terms of rural and urban. How can you ensure that the integrated national transport strategies works in both urban and rural areas, would you say?
I think that's one of the challenges. Looking at Look Now, this is going to be one of the biggest challenges, because quite rightly, very quickly, there's an attraction to big city regions, cities, because actually they need a lot of support, investment in transport. We have heard, for all sorts of reasons, social mobility, aging infrastructure, access to opportunity, jobs, housing. They do draw a lot of attention, but we're forgetting that actually transport for rural areas is really, really important too. And in fact, most of the big national infrastructure cuts across rural areas, and they are really important, back to the freight point, to enable the movement of goods between those city regions, for instance. So they feel like the concentration goes very quickly into city regions, while actually what happens in between those city regions is all rural, and nobody's really paying any attention to them in terms of how it interfaces with their own local, very limited local network. So it is a challenge, but that's again when STBs have come to help in terms of enabling collaboration between the different shire authorities, where they're facing really issues in terms of the commercial or not commercial element of buses. How buses are just, the bus services are being reduced year on year, and there's actually no transport network other than the road. So road becomes the only mode of transport that is the lifeline to many communities and to young people and businesses in the area. So again, it's the city region versus rural, actually investment in public transport versus actually acknowledging roads is really, really important for those communities. And therefore, what is the appetite for investment in new ways of providing public transport in rural areas? Demand responsive service, that's how I started my career, is back on. Everybody's talking about them again, because the data, the digital innovations that we have through apps and communicating with the customer is totally different to what it was. So all these things, STBs are in a really good place to facilitate conversations, create new thinking and ideas, and hopefully the Integrated Transport Strategy works for everybody and every corner of England, not just those big cities.
Gentlemen, again, would you like to add?
Thank you. Just to follow on from what Maria said, integrated transport, the focus is always starts out being on large urban areas. That's where the largest number of people are, it's where the largest number of journeys are, and quite rightly, that's where the immediate focus should be. And really impressive the progress that's being made here in Manchester in achieving that. They really are setting the path that we all need to follow outside of London. In the Peninsula, I am an area where a large number of people live in rural communities. 45% of our 3 million population are in rural areas. And rural is often referred to, when you come to talk about integrated transport, is all too difficult in rural areas. But I'm pleased to say that we've already started addressing those issues within the Peninsula. One of our local authorities, that's Cornwall, have led the way in looking at how you integrate rural bus-based public transport in delivering the one public transport system for Cornwall model. And coming back to what Guy said earlier about simplicity of transport systems, that was at the very heart of what Cornwall did, delivering a customer-focused bus-based system. Very simple principles underpinned that: one network, one timetable, one ticket, one standard, one brand. And the local authority worked with the operators to roll that out. And the progress of that joint working was monitored by Transport Focus annually. So you got a response back from the customers of what they were experiencing about the changes that were introduced. That system has seen a 13% increase in passengers when you measure that from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. 2.6 million more fare-paying passengers a year. That's huge in an area like Cornwall, where 20% of the people have a free pass. And in terms of ticketing, in partnership with the operators, we reached an agreement where they would accept one another's tickets. And that itself has been a huge difference to travelling on public transport in a rural area. 1 million journeys in 2 years using any ticket, any bus. So we have a model in Cornwall that we can use in rural areas. And what we're doing at Peninsula now, because we look across the boundaries, is to take that model and apply it across the other 4 local authorities in our area, so that will extend the benefits of that system, which is currently only available to the 550,000 people who live in Cornwall, to extend that to the 3 million people who live within the Peninsula. Now, if we can achieve the same level of integration as we did in Cornwall, right across the Peninsula, then we have the potential to increase journeys on the bus network by 6 million a year. Now, that kind of return brings more revenue into the fare boxes, means less of our routes need to be subsidised, which is less of a burden for local authorities. Most importantly, it gets more people out of their cars and using public transport. So can we achieve this? Yes, we can. Why? Because we've done it before.
Really, really interesting. Thank you for that. Thank you. And yes, would you also like to
I'll just
James?
add to actually it's a joint piece of work with Peninsula. We have a joint southwest rural strategy, and coming out of that, we're funding small little pilot schemes. It's really sort of seed funding, and we've invited bids in from various organisations and groups across the southwest. It's just very localised in some respects, but it's about trying to get different ideas out there, getting different ideas tested, providing that little bit of seed funding, as I say, to get it going. And this might set, some of these might be really successful, and it might set the model for extending these sorts of pilot projects elsewhere, because we are Western Gateway, like the Peninsula. It is a very rural area. We're not quite as rural as Peninsula, but 40% of our population lives within the main urban areas, but the rest lives in small towns and in very rural areas. So it's critically important to us to find and new ways and to support new ways to enable rural mobility. Because yes, I do take the point, which I think Luke made, about there's still going to be a role for the car in rural areas, and yes, there is, but we do need to not resign ourselves to that. We need to be as proactive as possible, encouraging alternative ways for people to get around and get access to their services.
Thank you. And I must say, I do genuinely find this very, very interesting. Like I said, I don't have a car, and I ditched, I used to work in London, so I got used to using public transport. So for me, hearing about what's happening across the country is really, really fascinating, quite heartening as well. I just wanted to round off by asking you one thing that the government ought to be doing as soon as possible in your views. I'll throw that out there to you.
I actually do welcome, from a strategic transport perspective, I do welcome the government's approach to the national infrastructure strategy, and to hear the link between the national transport strategy and the integrated transport strategy is really important, because I think what most people around the table need to know is certainty. What's really going to be the investment, the pipeline, to allow us to plan for our housing, to get on with supporting economy and many other things. So I think locking that down and really securing investment in those national programs and in national infrastructure is going to be really important. The second bit that we're quite excited in the Midlands is this whole idea about thinking about people and passengers, to your point, and ticketing. It's got to be sorted, hasn't it? I mean, that's just, we keep hearing, right, the fares keep going up, yet, there's not a correlation between the offer that people get and the ability to use different types of services with actually the price that we're paying. And the further outside London, we still not got really that ability to travel. You've done phenomenal work in Cornwall, in the West Midlands, we got the Swift card. We're all trying really hard together, but that would be a really, really straightforward benefit that it will affect and benefit everybody. So I think that would be really great. And thirdly, we need to sort out freight. We really need to put freight more on the agenda, and then the Midlands gets it. We are at the heart of the country. No matter where you are in the country, you've got to cross the Midlands or go through the Midlands, or you kind of bypass it. And no wonder we got all their fantastic assets and facilities in the Midlands when it comes to freight. But we generally need to put it more to the top of the agenda, and you've done a great job in explaining why. Really good.
Absolutely. Gentlemen.
One thing I could say to government, well, you're creating the opportunity, once in a generation opportunity, I think, to deliver an integrated transport system in England. But you need to make sure that follows through to the spending review. Because if we don't get the resources in which to deliver, then this will be another false dawn.
Yeah. Thank you. James.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Nigel said there about having the resources there, particularly in the light of the National Planning Policy Framework housing figures. I think hopefully this will not happen. It is going to be a challenge that we might end up with just an endless number of urban extensions which aren't built into the existing infrastructure or provided with new infrastructure. I get my wrist slapped by our chair when I say it's a challenge. He said, no, it's also an opportunity what's coming up with the National Planning Policy Framework housing figures. And it is an opportunity, but we do need to get it right, and it does need the resources. And I'd also just like to echo what Maria said about freight. we've tried to build freight into a lot of what we do, and Julian has been extremely helpful in advising both Peninsula and ourselves. We have another joint strategy, a joint Southwest freight strategy. Julian's been very helpful in advising us on what we should do, particularly on rail freight terminals most recently. And I think freight really does need to be up the agenda. It does, as Julian said, it's blindingly obvious, but it does get missed. And we're doing our best to raise freight awareness amongst our local authorities, amongst not just transport officers, but planning officers as well, and with our councillors too, to try and make sure that it isn't missed, and that we don't just regard it as something that's going to happen anyway. So, yeah, just a quick blast there to support freight.
Absolutely. Well, we have run out of time, I'm afraid, but I would like to thank you, panel, for your insights. It's really, really been interesting, fascinating. I've learnt a lot, and I hope our audience has too. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel.
Thank you.